Hi, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar, The Business Resilience Equation, which is a panel discussion on cybersecurity, insurance, and business continuity and disaster recovery. Before we get started, I have a few housekeeping items to cover. First, we'll aim to run about 50 minutes today. This webinar is being recorded, and you will get a copy of the recording and the slides after the event. And lastly, attendees are in listen-only mode, but I encourage you to put your questions into the Q&A function as we go. We pulled some of those questions in advance, but if we have time at the end, we'll get to yours if you add them as well. With that, I'd like to introduce you to our expert panel for today. First, we have Andres Franzetti, who is CEO and co-founder of Risk Cooperative, which he'll tell you about a little bit more in a minute. Then we have Nima Kamushi, VP of Cybersecurity Services at Dataprise, and Stephen New, who is the Director of Business Continuity and Disaster Recovery at Dataprise. My name is Stephanie Hamrick. I am a marketing manager at Dataprise, and I will be your moderator for today. So I'll give a brief intro to Dataprise for those who don't know us, and then I'll hand it over to Andres to do the same about Risk Cooperative. Dataprise is a national managed services provider providing services end-to-end for our clients. We have been doing this since 1995 with offices and clients across the United States, and our mission is to use technology to help you be better at what you do. So we deliver best-in-class managed cybersecurity, network, infrastructure, collaboration, BCDR, and end-user solutions to help you get there. On this session today, we're partnering with Risk Cooperative, a leading minority-owned insurance brokerage. Andres, do you want to tell us a little more about Risk Cooperative?
Absolutely. Well, thank you for having me today. Risk Cooperative is a full multi-line insurance brokerage and risk management advisory firm. We work with organizations across all industries and of all revenue sizes, helping them to develop their risk mitigation strategies and have an extensive focus in the cybersecurity and cyber insurance domain. We're licensed in all 50 states and able to work as well domestically as well as internationally. So a lot of good experience and anecdotes that we'll be bringing to the conversation today.
Thanks, Andres. That brings us to our agenda for today. We are answering questions submitted by the audience in advance that we've organized into three main categories: security, insurance, and business continuity and disaster recovery. Then we have a featured wrap-up question at the end to make sure we leave you all with actionable advice. With that, let's dive into this discussion with a few warm-up questions for all of you. First, how has the concept of resilience changed in recent years? And Nima, I'll hand this one over to you first.
Sure, thanks, Stephanie. From my lens, I think that what we're seeing is that more and more businesses are kind of becoming dependent on technology. And so a lot of business owners are starting to become kind of increasingly aware that all of their critical kind of business tasks rely on technology of some sort. And for some of the ones that don't, we generally kind of ask some of the more probing questions around, what would happen if you got ransomware? What would happen if you couldn't make your, payroll at the right time? And again, the intent with some of this isn't to kind of poke anybody, but really to uncover some of the depth and breadth of what level of resiliency that they need. So again, the goal with all that is just to make sure that we're right sizing the solutions for business resiliency so that you're allowing good kind of business delivery and then growth and innovation while simultaneously kind of covering the recovery capabilities that are needed for the enterprise.
Andres, Stephen, anything to add?
Yeah, I think just expanding on that, it's really about to be resilient now, you really need to be aware of all the risks on multiple fronts. I think the idea of being dependent on technologies like Nima mentioned is a critical component, and just third parties in general. So it's not just your organization that needs to be resilient, it's also your suppliers, your third party partners, your technology providers. You really need to look at resiliency through the whole supply chain and the whole ecosystem that you're working with, in order to make sure you identify those vulnerabilities and plan for those going forward as well.
Yeah, Stephen, anything to add?
Yeah, from a disaster recovery perspective, it's actually evolved greatly throughout the years. I mean, you've actually came from the backing up the tapes into the whole disaster recovery market now. I mean, just a couple of years ago, we would have to spin up a new VM and recover the files directly back to the VM from a file level restore. So, I mean, it's evolved greatly to where we can bring the VMs up into our disaster recovery environment. So I mean, it's warp speed ahead basically for the disaster recovery.
Hmm. So that question focused on the past a bit. So let's switch gears and talk about the future. So, what are the biggest threats to business continuity that you are seeing or that you believe are on the horizon for the next 5 years? Stephen, I'll send this one to you first.
Well, as we know, the threat actors out there are getting smarter and smarter these days. So, I mean, I, that's probably one of the biggest threats to business continuity in the next 5 years is from a security aspect, because as technology changes, and we all know that, by the time this webinar is over, technology will probably change again. I mean, there's new technology that gets created every single hour. So we, as business leaders in our different spaces, me being business continuity and disaster recovery, we have to stay one step ahead of the threat actors and the security vulnerabilities out there. Because, I mean, as technology advances, they're getting smarter and smarter with how they create these programs.
Mm-hmm. Nima, Andres, anything to add here?
Yeah, I mean, I'll take a quick swing at it. So I think a lot of organizations don't understand that they're kind of either actively or passively under attack all the time. So, the days of kind of saying, I'm too small a business to be attacked, no one's kind of looking at us, those are basically over. Attackers are, they don't care about how big your company is. They're using it in a way to be able to go after companies because it's going to earn them some level of money. And from a resiliency perspective, it's important because one of the first things we see them do is once they get in and they start to get access, one of the first areas that they go through, and I think over 90% of the time, is they actually go after the backups because they know that's what you're going to use to try to restore and recover things. So the dynamic on that threat is it's not just kind of a single cyber related attack. It's also going after other kind of what I'll call secondary systems on the recovery side also.
Mm-hmm.
And I think just to add to that, and maybe taking kind of a 30,000 foot view, I think aside from kind of the known threats and the known areas that folks are having to constantly battle, I think looking forward, we're seeing from a kind of threat or risk perspective, the sort of shifting threat landscape, right? So, I mean, 5 years ago, nobody would have really thought of COVID as a huge disruptor to business continuity. And from a technology perspective, what does that mean when you have to suddenly switch all your employees to remote work? You need VPNs, you need to be compliant, you need to manage privacy and security for your clients. So I think a lot of times, especially, small to mid-sized business owners, we are stuck in the weeds and we're firefighting and with all the onslaught of known sort of or anticipated threats from a cybersecurity perspective that Stephen and Nima outlined. But I think it's also that strategic planning and looking ahead and planning for what could occur, and then engaging, companies like Dataprise, Risk Cooperative, to really help to formulate some plans and some more agile, proactive responses to some of those scenarios. Because I think, unfortunately, we're going to see more and more of those what used to be outlier threats or scenarios occurring more so
Mm-hmm.
in the next few years ahead.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that leads us quite nicely into our first major topic here, which is going to be cybersecurity. So I'll hand these questions over to our resident cybersecurity expert, Nima, but Andre, Stephen, feel free to hop in on any of these if you'd like. So question one is, what are common mistakes that organizations make during the incident response process, and how can they be avoided?
Yeah, it's a great question. I generally kind of default to kind of my top three mistakes, if you will. So I think number one is I see a lot of business owners, and particularly on the technology side, when they have a breach, they immediately kind of go into anger and kind of rage mode. And part of that is if you think about it, it makes sense because they feel to some degree that they've been violated. But realistically, it's a big mistake because when you're starting to add in a lot of high emotions into a scenario that requires a lot of kind of clear thinking, it's really problematic for you because you're going to miss a lot of the key details that are going to help you in that recovery. And anybody who's kind of experienced this is if you're not able to kind of see the forest for the trees, it's a really, really kind of difficult thing. So one would be, just keep kind of good emotional kind of moderation. The second mistake that I see a lot of times is, there are folks out there that don't have a trusted partner prior to that event happening. And realistically, what they need is they need somebody who can go on the security journey with them, but also who they know they can rely on for the safe recovery of their systems, right? So the last thing you want to do is be making kind of recovery decisions or any other kind of decision along those lines in kind of a high stress, under duress kind of scenario, because it's much better to plan ahead and know exactly what you're going to do, who to contact, and how to do it. So having that, again, that trusted partner is kind of a key piece. And really, the third thing I think is really just, you need to have a plan, right? And it's not just having a plan, but it's having a plan that you've tested so that everybody kind of knows their roles, they understand what to do, how to do it, who do they contact, and really understand kind of the decision-making process and a lot of those things. Because there's going to be so much, information coming in from all directions that you really need to know kind of like, okay, this team is covering this, that person's covering that, so that you can kind of orchestrate it and do it in a more mature way rather than kind of highly reactive way.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think just adding to that, the other part I would say along those lines and having a plan and point of contact is coordination, right? I think from the insurance perspective, a lot of times what we see is that the carrier is brought into the conversation, after the fact, right? So that sometimes can mean that from a coverage perspective, depending on how the insurance policy is set up, who's approved on the breach response panel and the coverage components, sometimes we're seeing clients incur some costs because certain actions that they took don't line up with the requirements of the insurance policy. So I think according to what Nima said, it's important to not only have that plan, but then know how does your insurance policy coordinate with that plan? What are the notification requirements? How do you get your vendors and your partners, your data prices approved in that process so that you can have a seamless response and be efficient? Because time is of the essence, but you also want to make sure that you're not missing out on any coverage or incurring additional costs that are not necessary.
Mm-hmm.
It's a great call out, Andres. And I think the thing that I see a lot of times too is that coordination, that connective tissue, if you will, isn't always in place, and it really complicates things downstream. Whereas if you do just a little bit of handshaking and testing up front, it just saves a lot of time and effort on the back end.
Mm-hmm. All right, so let's move on to question 2 here. How can you convince business leadership to buy into the importance of incident response and not just focus on prevention? Nima, I'll hand this one to you.
Yeah, I think again, the main thing is just making sure that everybody is engaged and understands kind of what the impact of a lot of these things can be, right? If the business owners, they're generally focused on, they understand their business areas, right? They don't understand the cyber impacts or the risks or those types of things. I'm sorry, but they do understand the risks. They don't understand the cyber pieces, but they do understand the risks. So if you say to, for example, somebody in the accounting department, hey, what would happen if you can't process payroll? They get that, right? What would happen if you couldn't, receive revenue? They understand that fully. So it's really a matter of being able to kind of translate things out of technical terms into business terms to help folks really on their journey to kind of get things worked out. And then, the last part is I think also you complement that business conversation with some of the technical pieces, right? Running a pen test or having a tabletop exercise where you're actually facilitating it and trying to help people kind of understand this is what the impact could be. Again, here's some critical business functions. What would we do if we didn't have them? It makes it a lot more easy to get that buy-in that you're looking for.
Mm-hmm. All right, and question number 3 here. Can you just run down what an essential cyber set for businesses in the small to mid-market space might look like?
Yeah. Yeah, what I generally recommend for folks is kind of what I call my 5-step plan. So the first is, and we covered some of this real briefly, but just I would have a security, trusted security partner, right? you need somebody that you're going to be able to pick up the phone and call anytime something comes up and know that they're going to answer you and they're going to be able to kind of jump in real quickly. So number one, have that trusted security partner. Number two, I would have a plan for business recovery and incident management, right? Go through and plan some of those things ahead of time because it just makes it dramatically easier, as we've kind of pointed out, where you've got the orchestration and everybody kind of knows who's covering what things. And then the third step is test the plan, right? So you got a plan now, that's great. Step one or two in this case, but then we want to go test the plan. Like, let's pull everybody together where we can go actually kind of walk through it, make sure everybody understands their roles and requirements. Number four, I would say that you need to look at having cyber insurance with the appropriate coverage level, right? That's something that you should talk with your insurance company about to understand, hey, I'm worried or I'm concerned about these types of business risks impacting me, and working with folks to really get the right coverage level for your particular business. So trusted partner, have a plan, test the plan, have cyber insurance. And then number five is really, again, involve the leadership in those decision-making pieces, right? Not just testing it with them, but making sure that everybody kind of has buy-in, they've got skin in the game. And realistically, when you pull the leadership in, they all have a vested interest in protecting the business. So this is just one of the many duties that they perform in protecting the business. So those are kind of my 5 quick steps.
Awesome. All right, so we'll move on here into our second section of the day, which is going to be cyber insurance. Andres, I'll be handing these questions to you first. So again, Nima, Stephen, you're of course welcome to join in at any time. So first up, we have, how are insurance practices changing now that attacks are more frequent and more sophisticated?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think from the insurance perspective, cyber insurance has seen a lot of changes in the last few years. The market is sort of always going through a bit of an ebb and flow, and it's related a lot to how we're seeing these attacks, the frequency of the attacks and sophistication and the size of these attacks occurring. So I think the first thing is that we've seen the industry contract a little bit. So in terms of underwriting requirements and accessibility for folks, the bar has been raised. I think the 5-step plan that Nima just outlined is really the baseline for what an insurance company, an underwriting process is going to look at from an insurance perspective. They're going to want to make sure you have all these plans and policies in place. They're going to want to make sure you have the minimum level of preventative processes in place, like multi-factor authentication, backups, all of those components. So I think that's really kind of where the industry has gone. It's really just kind of that baseline. It's now going to be more rigorous review and underwriting in order to be able to get access to insurance. The second part of it is also we've seen the contraction in terms of coverage and availability of coverage. You're seeing more limitations on third-party providers and what is being offered from an insurance perspective, especially when you start getting outside of IT or you start getting into software and technology solutions, as we outlined a little bit earlier. There's a lot more specifics in the language and limitations that are being imposed. Similarly, for some of the attacks that we're seeing more frequently, like ransomware, we're seeing caps on those as well. So I think it's a matter of really, having to look at the policies, the coverage you're taking out, and doing a deep analysis to make sure you're getting the right level of protection and the best pricing as well. But it's really those two areas where we see the biggest shift.
Mm-hmm. So, what are some common gaps in coverage that you're seeing when businesses are purchasing cyber insurance?
Again, I think it goes back to what we were talking about with some of the limitations in coverage. I think a big area that we're looking at is the business interruption component. And Nima, again, alluded to this a little bit with payroll disruption and some of those other areas in terms of consideration. But we're also looking at what we call kind of the contingent business interruption, right? And if you think back to Kaseya and some of these examples where we've seen sticking on the technology front, those companies that were using those systems and that were impacted by that incident and had disruptions to their own businesses, many times the insurance policies weren't paying out because that wasn't listed coverage, or they were paying out at a much reduced rate where the companies were still not fully protected and they weren't able to continue or maintain operations as they would at a normal pace. So again, that's one big area where we're seeing that dependent or contingent business interruption piece have some severe limitations there. And then again, it goes to the sublimits of the policies. I will say not all cyber insurance policies are created equally. So there are a lot of different types of coverages and policies out there. And it's important for organizations to really do that self-assessment, know what their operations are, talk to their brokers about what their operations are, and make sure that all of these different areas of risk are identified and that those gaps are as minimized as possible.
Hmm. So I think this leads right in here. You've already talked about this a little bit, but how can businesses best prepare for the insurance application process?
Well, again, I'll throw it back to Nima here, but I think it's the five-step plan, right? I think it's working with your managed service and managed service security providers, your IT departments, making sure that you have all these baseline components in place. And then, as you're going through the application process, a lot of times we have companies that are reaching out to their partners or IT vendors to really help them complete the application process. And I think that close collaboration, making sure that you're getting credit for all the proactive steps that you're taking, is critical to prepare so that you're able to get the best type of pricing. And then, as we just talked about, you're also able to get the broadest level of coverage possible. But it's making sure you have those minimum thresholds met so that so that you can mainly get access to the insurance coverage in the first place. Because we are seeing again that it is very, very limited.
Hmm. All right, so now let's hop into our last topic here before we get to that featured wrap up question. These questions I will hand over to Stephen first, but again, anybody can chime in. First up in this section for Stephen, we have what are the most important elements of a BCDR plan, which I think is also similar to some questions we received on submissions on this topic of how do businesses get started in this area?
That is an excellent question, Stephanie, because organizations actually don't know where to get started, and that's where Data Prize can help them. Basically, a business continuity plan, the way that I approach customers is you need to come at this from a perspective that somebody just went into your data center and pulled the power cord. How do you function? So what you need to do is you actually need to go in, you need to get a list of key stakeholders, you need to get a list of assets, you need to get a list of who needs access to what assets. And then once you have all of this information, then we can help you prepare a business continuity plan. I mean, it's going to be a pretty good process. So the best advice that I could give you is probably the first thing you would need to do, you need to create an inventory of everything. You need to get a list of your stakeholders, um, who needs access to what resources, what are those resources. Um, so these are some of the questions that we're going to ask whenever we come in to do a business continuity plan. The first step is a business impact analysis. So that's actually where we get your RTOs and RPOs is by coming in and doing a business impact analysis with the customer to determine, okay, if you got hit by a tornado or hurricane, what would be impacted? What systems would need to be brought up? How much is the financial loss for every hour that you're down? Um, an example is we had a customer who went down because of a ransomware event. They were losing $1 million an hour.
Wow.
So it's very important to do that BIA or business impact analysis to understand the risk. Um, a disaster recovery plan, that is more of a proactive plan, or excuse me, a reactive plan after the disaster has already occurred. So a disaster recovery plan, um, you would want to start off with a BIA and then get a business continuity plan in place with a disaster recovery plan because those are actually three different types of plans. You have a business impact analysis that needs to be done prior to the business continuity. The business continuity plan um, that would basically list everything that you would need to do to make sure your business continues to operate after the disaster has has occurred. What do you need to do after that has occurred? And then a disaster recovery plan is a reactive plan um, that happens during the disaster. So you need stakeholders involved, who does what, basically create a war room, and then John in IT reaches out to, you know, end users, letting them know what happened. Your finance team is going to be involved, working with cyber insurance, and also your MSSP. So there's a lot of different steps, which the first thing would be starting off with a business impact analysis.
Awesome. And
And
I
I
think
think
this,
that's a
go ahead.
critical piece. Sorry, I was going to say, because I think from the insurance perspective, a lot of the questions always are around, what is our risk? What is the right type of limit that we need to take out? And I think understanding that business impact analysis, understanding the right type of liability potentially that you might be needing to absorb, as well as your business interruption components are critical. And a lot of times folks don't know how to quantify that piece of the puzzle. So that's a critical step.
What I generally like to see too, to that point, is to see the alignment between each one of the kind of critical business functions and what systems support those critical business functions, right? Because a lot of times, the business owner understands I need to be protective of, this function or that function, but they may not understand what are the underlying IT systems or technologies that actually support it. So if you've got that connective and traceability between them, it makes a lot of what Stephen and Andres are talking about a lot easier to kind of map out to understand how to protect it more effectively.
Mm-hmm. All right, so the next question here I think plays in quite nicely to the last one. They've checked those boxes for having the plan in place, Stephen. Now, what updates do they need to make over time so that these plans stay relevant?
Well, the first request that I would do is test your plan to determine what updates need to be made. So if you test your plan, you could see gaps or holes in the plan that need to be filled prior to the disaster. So one thing that we need to do is we always need to test our BCDR plans. That will help determine if it does need to be updated. But some of the relevant information that you need to update in your BCDR plan is have any systems changed? And that is probably a key one. An example is you're currently running on-prem Exchange, your IT department migrates to Office 365. That is, the Exchange server no longer has to be brought up in a DR environment. It is now a SaaS solution. Another one is basically migrating. An example is like SAP server, something like that, to a cloud-based application. That is probably the biggest change that we see during a DR event, where customers have migrated a on-prem solution to a SaaS solution. And now that is no longer needed in the DR plan. So that is probably one of the most relevant updates that we need to make over time. Is any migrations that you do, but I cannot stress enough to test the plans to make sure that they do function and they do need to be updated, or what changes you need to make to them.
Mhm. And our third question here, we received quite a few times, and you've covered it a bit already, but maybe just a quick recap. What is the difference between a business impact analysis and a business continuity plan?
So a business impact analysis, or what we call in the DR space a BIA, is actually it's a plan to understand your risk and your tolerance to an outage. So a business impact analysis will go through the details of what is impacted, who is impacted, what downtime your organization can risk. Um, how much money you're losing for the downtime. And all these are key components that are required to be able to give you a good RPO and RTO, restore point objective and a recovery time objective. because at the end of the day, a BIA or business impact analysis is to mitigate any risk and any capital loss that you may experience in the event of a disaster. Uh, a business continuity plan is a plan to keep your business operating in the event of a disaster, um, whether it be a security event, a natural disaster, a piece of hardware failing in your data center, a SAN that has all your VMs on it. A business continuity plan will limit the operational interruption that you experience from a natural disaster or a outage that could get your business up and running.
Awesome. So that brings us to our closing question here. A recent survey from SAS showed that only 47% of executives believe their organization is resilient. And when they dove into the key practices and markers of resilience, only 26% of businesses ranked as highly resilient. So there's clearly a need to drive more resilience and also to start right now. So I'll give each of you a chance to answer this question. And that is, what's one piece of advice you would give to businesses looking to improve their resilience posture in the next year? Nima, we'll start with you.
Yeah, my main thing is my best advice would be just to make sure that you assess your security program and identify kind of what you can do for next steps to improve your posture. Security is a journey, right? Where you're not just going to kind of magically show up and achieve the perfect state. So what's important is that you assess it over time, you continue to increment things over the time to be able to really get where you need to be. Again, I kind of think of it like saving for retirement. You want to put in a little bit over time, and then you get to where you want to be for your ultimate goal.
And Andres, same question for you. What's your one piece of advice?
Yeah, I think it's, I always come at it from the insurance and risk management side of the house. So I think my approach is always, do that extensive self-assessment, do that BIA analysis, but do it at a higher level view, that 30,000-foot view to see what's coming around the corner. And a lot of times from insurance, companies view that as a cost of doing business, not necessarily as a proactive or strategic investment. So they might go for the lowest cost solution. And it's, short-term savings can have long-term costs, is sort of what we always say. So make sure that when you are out there, you're analyzing the policies in detail, you're asking your broker any question that you may have, and doing that extensive analysis to make sure you're getting the right type of coverage. Because as we discussed with cyber particularly, there's a lot of different components that make up a cyber insurance policy. And the most important parts are what you're going to get for the breach response coverage, as well as what you're going to get for your business interruption coverages, not necessarily just the liability. That's the most straightforward component. So taking that analysis, it allows companies to basically take risk off of their P&L and put it onto the insurance policy. So it's a very important process to go through.
That's great. And last but certainly not least, Stephen, what's your one piece of advice for increasing resilience in the next year?
So, my one piece of advice is to visit those BIAs, the business continuity strategies now before it's too late. You don't want to go into a disaster without, reviewing those plans and coming to the table not knowing what to do. So we need to get with Data Prize today so that we can go ahead and review your business impact analysis and your business continuity strategies before the disaster hits. You would be surprised how many companies that we work with that have not tested those plans and have not reviewed their business continuity strategies going into a disaster. And as we know in technologies, things change every single day. Like I mentioned at the beginning of this webinar, by the time this webinar is over, technology would have changed again. So we need to make sure that we're up to date with technology. We review all of our business continuity plans, get our BIAs done, and we're ready for the disaster. And then after you get all those in place, I cannot stress enough, test, test, test. So we need to test those to make sure they work when needed. And if you run into an issue during the test, you need to get it resolved and document it. So that's that is basically my opinions on this.
Hmm. So, with that, I will say thank you to our three experts, Andres, Nima, Stephen. Thank you for sharing your knowledge with us. And for everybody watching live with us, if you're looking to drive resilience for your business, Data Prize and Risk Cooperative are here to help. We can help you increase your resilience posture in each of the three main areas we talked about today. Our managed cybersecurity plans can help you achieve next level security solutions for your organization and protection from end to end. If you have our premier cyber plan, then our partnership with Risk Cooperative and Converge Insurance can help you get up to 30% off of cyber premiums with streamlined underwriting and quoting as part of the Converge Connect program. And if you would like to investigate data protection and disaster recovery with our BCDR team, DataPrize is a Veeam Platinum partner, and we are one of the only partners who's developed proprietary data protection solutions to take Veeam's industry leading capabilities even further. So feel free to send us a note or scan these QR codes to learn more about any of those programs. And we will also be sending out the slides after event if you want to follow up on these later. And with that, I will say thank you so much for joining us. We do have just a couple of minutes here, so I'm going to pull up that question box. I also have some questions that were submitted by the audience beforehand, but just a little bit too late after our main program was filled, so we will get to some of those. The first one here, DORA, the Digital Operational Resilience Act of the European Union, will go into force in January of 2025. Do you think it is an effective way to help manage cyber attacks or other risks that can have an effect on institutions outside of the EU as well?
Yeah, I mean, I'll take a swing at that. I think so. It's still too early to kind of say what the full impact are going to be, just because it hasn't kind of gone into implementation just yet. What we do see from an industry perspective, though, is that um, the financial institutions that it is targeting already have pretty robust and resilient systems in place. Because think about it, they're financial institutions, right? They need to be able to track, transactions down to the minute or second and what terminal it came in from. I mean, really kind of finite things. And because of that, their entire programs are built around, building a really resilient structure. With that being said, I'm one of those people that I'm always for, more kind of proactive activity around this area. So if it helps folks, I think that's great. I do suspect though that it's probably duplicative in some areas with a lot of the existing kind of business and security controls that are out there though.
All right, and another question here. Can you address the risks and risk calculations you might make when dealing with the Chinese market?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing I'd recommend is just making sure that you understand what the compliance requirements are going to be. The regulatory environment there is significantly different than other environments. So, I would just make sure that you understand what you're signing up for, that you've got, again, somebody who can help you kind of navigate it, because I can guarantee you there are some really detailed kind of technical nuances of what you can and can't do, and things that may be okay here in the U.S. are definitely not going to be okay there, and vice versa. So I would really focus on the technical, on the regulatory requirements that you're going to have to inherit as a result of
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and
And
I
with
would just pile on to that from the insurance perspective. Again, it's about that coordination and making sure once you know what those requirements are, what the scope of your relationship or works is going to be, make sure to run that with against your insurance policy just to make sure there's no limitations. There might be if you're having access to networks or different components, or your networks, vice versa. Again, there might be some restrictions on your insurance policy, and you want to make sure that you're not negating coverage, or that if you are, you're planning for it accordingly. So just again, managing risk from that perspective.
It sounds like the theme today is get someone to help you navigate all of this.
that.
Exactly.
All right. All right. So that's all the questions we have time for today. So again, I will say both to our panel here and to everybody joining us live, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for joining us. We hope you learned something new from today's event, and we also hope to see you on the next one. Thanks.